back. And the next stage, a very popular component of the CentreCourt events is the committee. Because, of course, you'll be spending much of the afternoon talking to top business schools from around the world, highly selective. And, of course, all perhaps thinking about, well, how do I best put my profile forward? What are the things that I should be thinking about? So we've drawn on the insider admissions expertise, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage Amy Major, who's an MBA recruitment manager at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. Sitting next to her, Cassandra Pittman, who was both an associate director and admissions manager, associate director at INSEAD, and an admissions manager at London Business School, and also a Columbia MBA. You could have done this panel by yourself, Cassandra, with those sort of credentials. And Malvina Miller-Complainville, who was an assistant director at the Harvard Business School. So we have, we've put together 5 profiles, and some of the details about them. In fact, some of you have submitted these profiles for review today, and we'll use them as the sort of those behind-the-scenes discussions that actually go on in the admissions committee. So who do we have first? We have Drew, and of course a CentreCourt event in London. We should have at least one investment banker in this pool. Drew is looking to start school pretty soon. He's targeting a September class start this year, looking at London Business School and at Said. So Amy, I'm sure he'll be listening to your every word on this one. With a varied background across Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse out in Singapore. In terms of, he wants to stay in investment banking, so can obviously draw on his pre-MBA experience. Studied at NUS in Singapore, but only has a 2.8 GPA, which he's somewhat made up with a 710 GMAT, which is quite well balanced, and a number of extracurriculars that I'd love the panel to discuss their way through. Amy, Oxford is on the list. You probably see a lot of investment bankers in the pool, so that's one of the challenges, right? To stand out in a well-represented professional profile.
I think definitely investment banking, as many of us will know, is a very competitive sector. I think what Drew might want to think about is obviously if he's looking at starting in 2019, maybe hasn't yet applied, is his level of preparedness, not only to gain admission, but preparedness to perhaps be applying for investment banking internships, for example, in the autumn/fall this year. So I think that could be something he'd need to consider. Certainly the military background is really interesting. Certainly seeing people with this in their profile is really standing out, I think, against strong competitors in that market. So
if he'd just had investment banking, of course, within that pool, but you'd actually make note of, I guess, military service in Singapore. It's obligatory for, is it a 2-year period, which perhaps would also make him a slightly older applicant. Just talk about when he's looking to apply. Cassandra, many of the top US schools by this point, not just Columbia with rolling admissions, but Harvard has dropped round 3 this year. So there wouldn't actually be a chance for Drew to apply between now and the spring. How does that play out for some of the top European schools where the schedules can run a little bit later in the year? He's still up against the clock, no?
I would say yes. And if you talk to a lot of the schools here, they might say, I would imagine they'll say, they have places for good candidates in every single round. And that is true. But all things being equal, earlier is always better. And that's true everywhere. So we've seen round 2s close at most of the schools. And already, so he'd be looking at round 3s now for a 2019 start. Doesn't mean he doesn't have a shot, but I would say have a think about whether 2019 is the start date you're committed to. Might your chances be better if you applied in round 1 next year, and or maybe expanded that target school list to INSEAD and looked at the January intake?
Right, Malvina, at Harvard Business School, they're often talking about patterns of leadership that you can identify both, of course, in your professional development and how that's reflected in promotions, projects that you've been responsible for, but also there are a lot of clues when you're looking through extracurriculars. Is there anything that you see in Drew's volunteer work that you think that he could leverage to catch the attention of the admissions office?
Absolutely. I think just looking at his military experience actually is something that definitely we would want to highlight. Military profiles are highly sought after from MBA programs, but also in the corporate world. There are things that, skills and experiences that he's acquired in the military that will be beneficial as a student in the MBA program, such as being part of a team, leading teams, learning resiliency and working hard. Looking at his extracurricular activities, those are the things that he will need to really highlight, and ideally it would be good if he could link some of these skills to the goals that he wants. So really thinking about, as an investment banker, what those skills are that will make him successful in that field, and looking at the extracurricular activities that he is currently doing and what those links are between those two.
Right. A final word, Amy, just on GPA. He can't go back to undergrad and boost. Maybe he had a tough freshman year. Will the school look to understand the GPA? Should he spend much time explaining that? And what can he do? He's got a solid, well-balanced GMAT score. Would that be enough to sort of counteract the GPA, or are there other things that Drew could look to do to reinforce the academic credentials of his profile?
I think as Drew is looking at Oxford Said, I'll make a reference to how we would certainly view this. So I think the GPA, it is what it is. I often meet people who spend a lot of time talking about the past. You know, that GPA, you can't change it, and you have to just look at that for what it is. I think, therefore, you maybe want to address that in the application, but briefly and succinctly, don't labour the point, really. We really are taking a holistic approach to the whole application. So I think that's really important to stress, and I think the 710 GMAT does go some way to probably give most admissions committees some assurance that there shouldn't be too much concern about the academic rigour and your ability to get through that in the programme. So yes, make comments towards it, but focus on everything else, focus on the future, your purpose. I call it your why of what you're looking to achieve. So.
Right. So the why for Drew, he's got to get moving, because the deadlines are drawing close, perhaps looking at schools that even have January options, or waiting until next year. But I hope that Drew enjoy this afternoon and sharing your profile. Some positive things in there. Just needs to put it all together and watch his timeline. Yeah. Okay, who do we have next? We have Jana. Jana is an energy maven looking at school next year. And applying to some of the top US schools. INSEAD is in that mix as well. And her energy career across Shell, TransCanada, so good international background for a school like INSEAD, or in fact Yale. And energy, it remains the theme as she looks at post-MBA career goals, focusing on the developing world. Has an engineering background with slightly stronger GPA and has opted for the GRE. So I'd like to talk to all of you about GMAT versus taking the GRE. And again, perhaps the reinforcement of this passion for energy with co-founder of Carbon Code. Cassandra, let's start with you. What did you like about Jana's profile?
I wanted to talk about the GRE.
Okay.
So INSEAD won't accept the GRE from her because the INSEAD will only accept the GRE from candidates who live in countries where the GMAT is not taken. So that is something significant that she needs to consider. In working with a lot of different clients at Fortuna who have applied to a lot of different schools, again, I might say something that's a little bit is a little bit of a departure from what you might hear from the official line from the schools. My experience is that most schools have at least a slight preference for the GMAT, no matter what their official position is. So I want to encourage her to reconsider taking the GMAT for those reasons. However, that said, from her extracurricular and volunteer experience and how it mirrors with her employment experience and her post-MBA goals, she comes across to me as somebody who is very passionate. And I like that very much. And that's something I'm going to look for in how she builds her narrative and her essays. I'm going to be really looking for that engagement and that passion. I'm going to be looking as well at her recommenders to talk about that enthusiasm she has to essentially to test her post-MBA career goals. You know, how likely is it that she's going to pursue something that's so challenging and be successful at it?
Right. And on one of these panels at the CentreCourt in San Francisco, we had the Dean of Admissions from Stanford, Kirsten Moss. Now, the school's slogan is change lives, change organizations, change the world. She says sometimes we see candidates that make they have this big vision, this big claim of what they're going to do, you know, clean drinking water in sub-Saharan Africa, whatever it might be. Malvina, when you look at clients, looking at their background, and how that's also expressed through extracurriculars, and as you tie that into those post-MBA career goals of how they want to change the world, Cassandra's point, it's important to be able to trace where those passions come from, right? So it's not just coming out of left field.
That's right, and I think that that's actually a real strength in this person's profile, as you see her passion not only in the professional career that she has been developing, but also in the extracurricular activities and the volunteering that she's doing. There's a clear link and a clear story there, and that's really jumping out on the page, and that's very powerful. And I also actually want to just mention, I think it's really interesting to see her choice of recommenders. So she has recommenders from 2 different companies, which can be a really wonderful way to provide a 360 overview of the types of projects that you worked on, but also when you tap into 2 recommenders from different periods of your life, you can have your recommenders talk about the progress that you've made and the growth that you've made over the years, and that can be, again, that can be a really good story. So I think there's some really good strengths there.
Right. Amy, Said accepts the GRE, and in fact, the GRE schools using it in the last 8 or 9 years, part of it was to move towards stronger gender balance. They saw many women applying to graduate school, not necessarily business school. Well, let's make the GRE an option. So would that sort of discount any of Cassandra's comments? Would you look at the GRE with an equal weighting?
I mean, I believe we are genuinely, we've just come out of our very large stage 3 admissions committee, so this session is timing very well for me. I genuinely think we are really looking at both very equally. Definitely seeing more women taking the GRE than men, I would say. And I think that's given the sort of verbal focus that the GRE is known to have. Many women believe they're better at verbal than quant. No matter how you cut that, it's often the view. So we would look at either. Obviously, the GPA is a little bit on the lower side, but I think there's some great. If you look at the employer history, and I think what Cassandra commented on in terms of the depth of this person's profile, I think it's as much about the story as it is the academics here.
Right. Right.
I think what I was going to comment on is that they're looking to start a business, and I think they need to consider as well that they may be against applicants who already have a fully fledged venture, and so I think it's important to really not craft an in-depth business plan. You're not at sort of Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, but definitely give some thought to what that looks like, so that you can address the potential success of your future plans.
So rather than just speculate, I'd like to start a company when I come out of business school, it's to give some sort of substance and ideas to that.
Yeah, I think energy is a big sector, so you may have people on the admissions committee who are not energy professionals reviewing your profile, so you almost want to demonstrate that you're the expert in what you're looking to move into.
Yeah. Energy well spent, if you can forgive the pun. Slade, we welcome Slade to this afternoon's event. Slade is an early applicant, thinking a couple of years down the road, and I'd love to talk about how that early planning, how they can really use that extra time. Malvina, he's looking at school 2 years from now and a cross-spread of the top European and US schools, currently in a PE fund. Many MBAs actually want to move into private equity coming out of school, but he wants to pick up on the internship he did at McKinsey in younger years and head back to MBB, focusing on possibly elderly care, which of course is another growing business. Came out of school 4 years ago, extenuating circumstances about GPA, and obviously we'll have that conversation, and is a boxer. We don't see that often in extracurriculars. 2 questions for you, Malvina. Which part of the resume do you read first? The extracurricular that tells you the boxer, or where they went to school, where they're working? And again, Slade, how can he use this extra time to really sort of put together the profile that's going to resonate a year or so from now?
Personally, I read top down.
You do? That's very disciplined of you.
Certainly the boxing does catch your eye and makes you think, and it would be really interesting to hear more about that and how it relates to the rest of the story. In regards to applying 2 years out from now, I think he has a real opportunity to think about taking some stretch projects and looking at, well, so he's interested in going into MBB, right?
Right.
Networking. I mean, I think that whenever you're a candidate who's looking to change the industry that you're in, the function that you're in, networking is so important for, I mean, it sounds, not exciting when I say that, but it is really important because you need to understand the career paths that you can follow in those new industries. And you need to be able to talk about it in a way where you do sound like an expert, where you're using the vocabulary that is used in those industries, and you sound like you understand how people build careers within that new industry. And networking is a great way to do that, reaching out to people who are working in MBB, and how did they get there, what kind of projects are they working on, how is MBB organized, and just really understanding the nitty-gritty of the organization of those careers. And that's something that, the sooner you start that, the better position you are in, because then you can adapt your story to that. Okay, so I understand what will make me successful in this career. This is what I've done so far. This is how it relates to what I want to do. And you can build that. And then if you identify some areas where you may be missing some experiences, for example, that's when you actually have the time to volunteer yourself for stretch projects, or even just looking for mentors within your company who could help you.
Amy, within the context of Trump, however long that will last, and uncertainties around H-1B visas, nothing's changed, but the processing time has been considerably extended, and that's encouraging people to perhaps look outside of some of the US schools. Here's Slade, who has worked in Dubai. As he applies to those European and those US schools, how important is that international experience? Is that something that you really want to see? You have 40, 50 nationalities in the classroom at Said Business School. How important is that sort of international credential to you?
I think it's becoming ever increasingly important to have international experience, and I think I would probably link that to flexibility. Coming back to your point about the visa, people naturally look to London or some of the bigger US hubs for post-MBA career goals, but there's some great opportunities also coming up in more regional hubs as well. So I think, having already worked in Dubai, which is an incredibly developing market, this person might want to think about the flexibility of their goals in terms of where they might want to go. I heard a great speaker on a keynote that we had at Oxford Said a few months ago, and she gave a great example of actually taking that opportunity, which is in somewhere that you'd never expected you would go, can sometimes really propel your career forward at a much faster rate. So I think definitely having some international experience. Perhaps Slade might want to hone on a little bit more in terms of location and also that career goal. He's obviously looking at quite a few options at the moment. So right. Really developing that plan over the next 2 years before he applies is probably crucial too.
Right, so using the time and that forward planning. So Slade's got 18 months, and I hope enjoys CentreCourt for that planning.
Do we want to come back on the extenuating circumstances?
I think you would, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Just because I think this is something that we see a lot, whether it's with the GPA or maybe you took a position with a company, it didn't work out, you left earlier than you wanted to, or anything like that in life. And I really want to just emphasize that the importance is to be really authentic about the story you tell and understand what the impact is and what the school's looking for. So for example, in a case of a lower than GPA, what a school wants to be assured is that you are up to the academic rigor of the MBA program. So they're going to want you to know why it is that you didn't perform as well as you might have done in your undergrad or any other work that you've done. And they're going to want you to show that that you have another way of showing that you are up to that academic rigor. Now, for some people, that answer is, I only discovered later I had ADHD, or I had a loss in my family, or I had an illness, and that is absolutely fine if that's the truth. If that's not the truth, just saying and showing the self-awareness to say, I did not have the maturity to understand at 18 what this would lead to, but that is why I have dedicated the last X number of years and X number of months preparing for the MBA program, and here let me show you all the other ways that I can show you my academic potential. That's what's important. And so that's just...
And that could extend to an online course in stats, finance, accounting, just something that shows that sort of academic rigor.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, great. And Chester, is there anything that we need to do with our mics to avoid the feedback, or... No, my digitally connected socks, that's not... okay, all right. So, Agnetha, who's got an impressive career in marketing, looking at 4 of the top European business schools, and has a background with a global data provider, and in the last 3 years has already moved up through 2 promoted positions, wants to use business school to make that switch to consulting, comes from Stockholm University. Now, Swedish grading system, I don't know it off by heart. Amy, within the admissions office, would Agnetha need to convert her grades to the 4.0 GPA, or do you have enough Swedes applying to the school to understand the A's, the B's, the C's? I mean, it's A, B, B, A clearly from this one, but would she need to translate her grades?
We wouldn't ask her to translate the grades. So our admissions office... we've got 60 plus nationalities this year in our cohort, and so the admissions office are very familiar with making any conversions that are needed. I'd always stress that if you do have a degree where it's maybe been gained from, different universities, where you've done a sandwich year, where you've then gained a different grade, for example, or if you feel there's an explanation that needs to be made, just add that as an extra note, perhaps at the end of your essays. But we will be able to make the conversion from the full transcripts that you provide. So
right. And you're also mindful of the institutions themselves. Maybe a B from Stockholm University along with Lund and Catalina. These are top institutions within the country. So are you sensitive to where they're going to school as well as the grades that they achieved?
Absolutely, I think it's definitely we will always consider the calibre of an institution in which you've studied. So absolutely, we will take that into account when you're considering your profile and the grade that you have achieved.
Right. The numbers that move into management consulting coming out of business school. Cassandra, is that a sexy story to sell to business schools, or sounds like so many others? Given her background working in marketing and sort of data, would that make sense to these schools, do you think?
Yeah, well, I tend to think that going into consulting is great, because you can have an added advantage as a consultant pretty much no matter what your previous professional background is. I do think it's important in your narrative to figure out what makes you unique and what makes you stand apart. But that doesn't need to be in your career goals. Ultimately an MBA is an MBA, and most of us go to get one to do better in business, whatever that looks like for us. So I think that's absolutely fine. I think that's a very realistic career goal. Circling back on what was said before, I think, we'd want to see, has she done some networking now? Does she understand what consulting is? How does she understand what consulting is? Is she looking at MBB? Is she looking at more specialist marketing consulting, boutique firms? Where is she going? But she has fantastic international experience, solid academics, you know, I think that with the right narrative and a really tight career goal and the way that we position that, she should have every shot at every one of the schools that's on her list.
Right. Malvina, you spoke earlier about an individual that was going to 2 employers and the voices that might provide. What would you, assuming that Agnetha's been with the same employer since she graduated 3.5, 4 years ago, who might she look for? And what are schools hoping to really understand from a recommendation? Is it just, oh, she's great, her work's been great? What are the sort of insights and perspectives that schools would really love to discover?
Well, I think that one of the things that typically schools are looking for feedback from the person supervisor, so the person that they reported into, and they're looking for very concrete examples and an analysis of the candidates' achievements within the company, how they performed, how they held themselves, how they carried themselves with other team members, colleagues. And that kind of content really provides a fuller picture to the application. I think when I look at Agnetha's profile, I think one of the things that is interesting is the promotions that she's received since she started working. And that's certainly something that would be good for the recommender to talk about. How, you know, is this a fast-track promotion? Is she performing, is she getting promoted faster than her peer group? That's something that the recommender should highlight. And that's certainly something that sometimes the recommender can also provide information on how you've excelled in a way that doesn't sound, that would maybe be a little bit awkward for you to say, you know, I was the best and I, you know, got the promotions the fastest. But when you have actually your recommender talk about that, it can come across a little bit more natural and less, what's the word? Arrogant, thank you. That's certainly something that I would look at doing here.
Right. Now, Amy, you mentioned having just got to the end of round 3, and therefore, you know, these long, lengthy discussions as you're crafting the profile, both given the time we have left, but also the idea that in dinner parties and cocktails, we very quickly make impressions of people, sometimes in the first 30 seconds that will endure for a long time. So I'm not saying I give you 30 seconds for the last profile, but sometimes you can pick up very quickly. So if we look at Marcus, any of the 3 of you, what jumps out in a positive or an alarming way that would shape the first impressions as that you're looking through this profile in the admissions committee? What makes you say, here's someone we should be spending more time? He's looking at school next year, works in media, has worked with CNN and the Discovery Channel, wants to stay in that industry, went to school, outstanding GPA, so his numbers are good. What jumps out? Malvina? One
of the things that I noticed was in his choice of recommenders, senior research manager. I'm not sure if this is someone who would have done recommendations in the past or have experience doing recommendations for MBA candidates. And I do think it's a good idea to have a sit down with your recommender and talk about what the expectations are, how competitive the MBA programs are, what they're looking for, what kind of profiles are they looking for, and to communicate that with your recommender and to have a discussion about the type of content you would like them to discuss in the recommendation, you know, what should be highlighted, especially when you have a recommender who may be very unfamiliar with business school applications.
So I live here in London, in Soho, so I'm very attuned to the problem we have at the moment with homelessness. And so one of the things that's really jumped out at me is this charity that he runs, distributing food, and particularly that he runs the charity, not just that he is involved in it. So I would really want to know more about this story. How did he, is he passionate about this issue? Did he found this charity? Did he just take on a leadership role? I'm really interested to see that as a community engagement piece. And I'd also, because he does work in media, which is not the most common field. We do have people, I mean, we have a few people every year, but it's not the most common. So I'd want him to tell a really good story about why he needs an MBA for this next step. and again, the research that he's done around that.
So a job title isn't enough. It's actually giving you enough context and understanding, whether it's for their charity or the roles that he's played in media, to really understand what drives him and his motivations.
Yeah.
Great. Amy, final word?
I think really just following on from what you've just said, you know, don't be afraid that you're not going to be the right fit because you're not from a typical MBA pathway. Most programs, every program here in the room today will have an incredibly diverse student body, and I think this person has a great opportunity to really show off their strengths in that sector, and definitely the opportunity, because they're looking to stay in media, to be incredibly well networked by the time they come to the MBA, to make sure they can make that post-MBA move. And again, I think I'm really interested in the charity that they're working on. Is that something that could be something bigger in the future, really? So,
right. So that's a really nice point to bring the committee to an end. And everybody attending the event today has a very unique, a very personal story. And this idea of, you know, where business school might fit in with those plans. So wear that unique story with pride. Enjoy discussing your profiles with the schools. Coming up next, we're going to have admissions directors from London Business School, Yale School of Management, University of Cambridge, and Carnegie Mellon Tepper. So we'll welcome them up onto the stage in a couple of minutes. But I'd just like to thank the committee for your pithy and thoughtful insights. And Cassandra, Amy, you'll be with us, perhaps Malvina, to take some questions from today's audience. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.